Most people learn that Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation across the American South. But the full scope of what those laws actually covered rarely makes it into a classroom. The term Jim Crow itself came from a minstrel show character created around 1830 by a white performer named Thomas Dartmouth Rice, who built a stage act around a dim-witted, shuffling caricature of a black man. Rice called the character Jim Crow and performed the role in blackface to audiences across the country. That degrading theatrical invention eventually became the name attached to an entire legal architecture of racial oppression. The laws began taking hold in the 1870s and extended through the middle of the 20th century, touching virtually every corner of daily life across the southern states. By the time the system was fully constructed, it governed not just schools and transportation, but leisure activities, courtroom procedures, even the most routine social interactions between black and white Americans. Rice's caricature became enormously popular by the mid-19th century. The image was performed thousands of times across America, becoming deeply embedded in the nation's cultural consciousness. This theatrical representation provided a kind of cultural permission structure for legal structures that would follow. The minstrel show tradition normalized the idea that racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable. The sheer specificity of some Jim Crow statutes reveals how deliberately the system was designed to humiliate and control. In 1930, Birmingham, Alabama, made it illegal for black people and white people to play checkers or dominoes together. In 1935, Oklahoma prohibited black and white residents from boating together on the same watercraft. New Orleans required that prostitutes be segregated by race. Atlanta courtrooms provided black witnesses with a separate Bible to swear on. These were not informal customs or social pressures. They were written laws, enforced by the state. Jim Crow etiquette was just as rigid outside the courtroom. White people were never formally introduced to black people. The introduction only ran one direction. White people called black adults by their first names as a matter of course, while black people were required to use courtesy titles when addressing white people and were forbidden from using their first names. This code of conduct operated alongside the written statutes as a comprehensive system of daily dehumanization. The legal foundation for all of it was set in 1896 when the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. What most history courses don't emphasize is that the case was deliberately engineered as a legal challenge. A New Orleans organization called the Comité des Citoyens recruited Homer Plessy specifically to test the constitutionality of Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890. Plessy was 7/8 white and 1/8 black, which made him legally black under Louisiana law. The lawyers behind the challenge wanted to expose how arbitrary and scientifically absurd racial classification actually was, hoping the court would be forced to reckon with questions it couldn't cleanly answer. In 1892, Plessy boarded a whites-only rail car in New Orleans and was arrested. The case worked its way to the Supreme Court, where the justices ruled in a 7-1 decision that racial segregation laws did not violate the Constitution as long as the facilities provided to each race were equal in quality. The practical consequences of this ruling became apparent almost immediately. States used it as constitutional justification for codifying segregation in every sphere of public life imaginable. Laws grew increasingly elaborate, creating systems where avoiding violation became nearly impossible for black citizens. Violating Jim Crow laws could result in criminal charges, fines, and incarceration. The criminal justice system itself became another mechanism for enforcing racial subordination. Judges and juries, predominantly white, consistently ruled to reinforce segregation. Federal courts showed little inclination to scrutinize state segregation laws, leaving black citizens with minimal legal recourse. The lone dissenting justice was John Marshall Harlan. who warned that the decision would open an era in which the rights of black citizens could receive no meaningful federal protection. He was right. The ruling stayed on the books for nearly 60 years. In practice, the separate but equal doctrine never required that facilities actually be equal. States consistently underfunded black schools, providing deteriorating buildings, outdated textbooks, fewer resources at every level. The gap in school funding between black and white children was significant from the beginning and continued widening well into the 20th century. Black parents were also legally barred from participating in the local governing bodies that oversaw their children's schools, cutting off any avenue for challenging those conditions from within the system. The economic consequences of Jim Crow were just as severe as the legal ones. They compounded over generations. In the decades after the Civil War, black land ownership in the South had been growing steadily, from roughly 3 million acres in 1875 to 8 million in 1890 to 12 million acres by the turn of the century. That growth was then systematically reversed. Sharecropping arrangements tied black agricultural workers to cycles of debt they could rarely escape. Redlining, restrictive housing covenants. Discriminatory lending practices blocked black families from buying homes in appreciating neighborhoods and accumulating the kind of generational wealth that property ownership could provide. By 1963, the average white family held roughly $117,000 more in wealth than the average black family. By 2013, that gap had grown to approximately $500,000. Reflecting decades of compounding inequality that traced directly back to the mechanisms of the Jim Crow era. The persistence of this wealth gap reflected how thoroughly Jim Crow's economic mechanisms had embedded disadvantage into American structures. Discriminatory lending practices, restrictive housing covenants, and employment discrimination were not isolated incidents but systematic features of how the economy functioned. Banks refused to lend to black borrowers or offered substantially worse terms. Real estate companies steered black families away from appreciating neighborhoods. Employers consistently paid black workers less for identical work. These patterns operated together, each reinforcing the others, making economic advancement extraordinarily difficult, creating wealth disparities that would persist for generations. One of the most significant but underappreciated consequences of the Jim Crow system was the Great Migration. Beginning in the early decades of the 20th century, black Americans left the rural South in enormous numbers, relocating to cities in the Northeast, Midwest, West in search of employment and basic safety. What history courses often leave out is that the conditions they encountered in the North were frequently not better. Segregation in northern cities was often more rigid in practice than the legal framework suggested, with black residents confined to specific neighborhoods through a combination of economic pressure, real estate discrimination, and sometimes outright violence. The Great Migration was not an escape from Jim Crow so much as a relocation of its effects into a different geographic context with different mechanisms producing similar outcomes. Historian William Chafe has written about a strategy that developed inside black communities under Jim Crow that he described as walking the tightrope, a set of practices and behaviors designed to minimize exposure to the worst violence and legal consequences of the system while preserving some degree of dignity and community life. These internal resistance strategies were sophisticated and continuous, operating long before the organized civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s captured national attention. Black institutions, churches, newspapers, fraternal organizations, schools functioned as protected spaces where community life could persist and resistance could be organized. The NAACP was filing legal challenges documenting atrocities, pressuring the federal government for a throughout the 1930s and 1940s, years before Brown versus Board of Education changed the legal landscape. The civil rights movement that most Americans recognize was the visible culmination of decades of sustained effort that had been ongoing in less visible forms throughout the entire Jim Crow period.